Hi, everyone. I just wanted to welcome you guys to the call. We're really excited for you all to be here. I'm sure some people will join as we get started. But I just wanted to start off by introducing Sean. Sean Roberts leads Code.org's policy work in multiple states. He is a former classroom teacher, and he has led state advocacy efforts in areas such as funding equity, teacher certification, and school accountability. So prior to joining Code.org, Sean served as an executive director of a school advocacy association and a district human capital consultant. And I'm sure he has many other things that we could talk about, but I thought we would want to just dive right in. So Sean, if you want to take it away.
Yeah, hey everybody. Nice to be here and nice to be able to talk with you all about the state of computer science in Indiana today. I just want to start by going over quickly kind of where we've been and where things have headed nationally, and then I'll talk about where Indiana has been in the past year with regard to computer science policy. And then where we think things are headed for 2019. Just to give a quick background and some additional context on Code.org, in case you're not familiar with us, we're a national nonprofit focused on making computer science a fundamental part of our K-12 system across the country. We do that primarily through our education team, providing free and open source resources for classroom teachers and students. We also do professional development through our regional partner network in states all across the country. I think we're up over 50 regional partners now nationally. And so that's kind of the main thrust of our work. And then my team works on advancing state policies that are going to improve access for all students for computer science in countries or in states all across the country. I get to work with a lot of different states. I'm really excited to be able to work with Indiana. I actually grew up in Indiana, though I live in Wisconsin now. I grew up on the south side of Indianapolis, so it's always a pleasure to get to work in my home state and get to come home, especially when I can schedule my trips around IU games or Pacers games. That always works out pretty well. So glad to be with you all here today. With all that, I'll go ahead and share my screen. I have some slides to share here, so we can go through those. Okay. So first, as I said, I'll start with some of the policy trends we've seen nationally and talk about the momentum we've seen behind computer science policy. Many of you may have seen this before, but these are our 9 policies that we think really make a difference for states to enact that are going to make computer science a fundamental part of our schools. So just quickly running through those, the first 2 are really about defining computer science and defining what a plan would be for a state. So creating a state plan for computer science. How are we going to get access so all students can access computer science courses, and defining computer science and having standards for computer science so that teachers and parents and students have guidance on what computer science is and what they can learn in their courses. The next 3 are really about building up the teaching force for computer science. CS is a little bit different in that it's not something that a lot of universities already certify for. So it kind of becomes a chicken and egg question of, so we offer all these courses, where are we going to get the teachers? But then on the other end of it, it's like, where the teacher is going to come from if there aren't courses being offered, or why would we create teachers for courses that aren't being offered? So these policies really speak to that issue. First, allocating funding for professional learning for computer science teachers or teachers that are going to teach computer science. Having clear certification pathways so that there is a way to get certified for computer science, and it's not just sort of left up to an unrelated field, or someone that maybe just thinks they're teaching a computer science course, but it's not really computer science, having that clear certification pathway is really important. And also to create programs at colleges to prepare pre-service teachers. At the state level, we recommend that states establish a dedicated computer science position. Again, as this is a kind of newer course and maybe not as widespread to our education system as something like science or math is, that's been fundamental for decades, if not longer. Having someone at the State Department that can kind of help troubleshoot and set the stage and coordinate efforts and resources toward computer science, we've seen be really effective. And the final three are really about broadening access to computer science. So the first one being that requiring all high schools to offer computer science. That really expands access. We know that when you offer computer science courses, kids take them. Kids and parents love computer science. And the most recent data I've seen, it's only behind performing arts, or as like the most positively rated courses by students and their families. So kids really enjoy it, and it's a fundamental skill, as you all well know. Also, the final two are dedicated to ensuring that computer science counts. This really gets to an access of equity in computer science, so that computer science counts toward graduation and satisfies admission requirements at institutions of higher education. When you're able to do that, you're broadening access, because students can take it to meet their goals of graduating or going on to college. When it doesn't count, then maybe only the folks who are taking computer science courses are ones that might have the luxury of being able to take multiple electives or something. So we want to make sure all students have access. So those are kind of our 9 policies that we started out with about 5 years ago. And just to give you a sense of where that's gone in the past 5 years, you see on the left of your screen in 2013, we only had a few states that had at least one of those 9 policies enacted. And now we have 46 states. And this map we just created this map a few weeks ago, and fortunately it's already out of date. We love seeing that. We love when our stuff is out of date that we've just created weeks ago, because it means there's momentum happening, as Missouri recently passed a pretty comprehensive bill just in a special session a few weeks ago, that now they have 3 of the policies are checked yes. So we really only have 5 states now without a policy that they've enacted, and we would anticipate several more of those will be moving in that direction in the coming year. So that just gives you a sense of kind of the momentum nationally around computer science. And as far as beyond just passing one policy, this map shows the states that have enacted, it gives you a sense of how many policy states have enacted. So again, you see Indiana is pretty decently dark purple. And as I'll talk about here in a minute, again, this map is a little bit out of date. Indiana should be a couple shades darker already, just over the past month or so, with momentum and progress that's been made. So we came up with this idea, these 9 ideas like 5 years ago, thinking these would be the things that would move the needle on computer science and expand access across the country. So really for the first time now this year, we've been able to look at how does adopting those policies actually impact access to computer science across the country. And I'll talk about how we've done that in just a second. But broadly speaking, the results have been really strong, and we're really pleased with those results. So you can see the more courses you actually offer in computer science, the more access students will have to those computer science courses. So this fits our hypothesis pretty well. We're relieved, because that keeps me in a job, because we made this bet saying that if you do these things policy-wise, it'll expand access. And that's actually been true to a pretty significant degree. And I would anticipate, as we have more states passing more policies, and states that have passed these policies or implemented these policies have a few years under their belt, that the slope gets even steeper. And we've seen that from states like Arkansas, that we're really a leader in this space in terms of moving policy to increase access to computer science courses. And they're going to continue to expand their access. They're at, they're at about 64% right now, and I would anticipate they continue to go up as they get more experience and have more years under their belt with their computer science plan. So how did we know all this? How do we know like what access looks like in various states around the country? That actually comes out of our K-12 CS Access Report, which we just released for the first time a couple weeks ago. And this is really the first time a report has been done to this scale, where we look at, we actually take a census of what schools are offering in states all across the country. Now, some states we don't have 100% of school data for, so we leave them out of that. There are various reasons for that. Some states actually don't track course data that their high schools offer. Other states just have kind of like long and cumbersome processes for requesting the data. So we're going to continue to get more data and collect more data as time goes on. But we felt like we had about half of states when we released the report, and now we have about 30 states that we do have data on for close to 100% of their public high schools, and that gives us a pretty good sample size to work from. So far we have about 67% of all high schools in the country that we know whether they teach computer science or not. And based off that data, we can say for sure at least 21,000 schools teach computer science in the United States as of right now. Breaking that down state by state, here you can see the states that we do have close to 100% of data for. And again, more data is constantly coming in, and we're getting more states. I know we have Wyoming we recently added to the list. I would anticipate Illinois is coming pretty soon. I think we just added Tennessee. But as far as it relates to Indiana, you can see we're doing an okay job actually so far. So the states that are shaded in darker purple have more schools that are offering computer science. I think we're about fourth in the country in terms of access, just behind Utah at 54%. And I would anticipate with the momentum we've seen in policy in Indiana here in the past several years, that will continue to increase. I always point out Rhode Island being at 78%, and people are like, wow, what's Rhode Island doing? And turns out they just have like 8 high schools statewide. So it's a little bit different of a sample size and a little bit different of a challenge they have than some of our larger states. But you can see we're in pretty good shape. And as I said, I think that will continue to increase as time goes on. And so looking at states and whether they're offering computer science in various schools, we can also do really interesting things with this data and look at how these states perform with regard to providing equitable access. So we know it's not just enough to get computer science in the same schools or to a subset of schools that maybe have already had it or have offered it in the past. We want to make sure that all students have this opportunity, so we're not exacerbating the gaps between the haves and have-nots for computer science. So we can look at this data and compare it to other factors. So the first graph on your left shows how states are doing with providing computer science to schools with different buckets of underrepresented minority students. And unfortunately, this is an area we have a lot of progress to make. So you see schools that are 75 to 100% of their student population is underrepresented minority students, only have about 27% of those schools offer one computer science course. That's simply not good enough, and that's one of the problems we're seeking to solve through providing access to all schools. The same is largely true for if you look at income levels. So schools that have between 75 and 100% of their students receiving free and reduced lunch benefits, again, only 24% of those schools offer computer science. And as you get into larger and larger populations of students receiving free and reduced lunch benefits, then that number decreases. So that's eye-opening, but we're certainly glad to have that data. You can also look at community type. So whether students live in a city or suburban schools or rural, these are based off the National Center for Education Statistics definitions of city, suburban, town, and rural. And suburban students actually have computer science to a much higher degree, or access to computer science to a much higher degree than any of the other categories. But I think this also underscores that we need to do more work and more outreach to our rural communities. We do have polling data that suggests that rural and small town parents and students and families see the need for computer science just as much, or sometimes a little bit more, than city and suburban parents respond favorably to. But yet there's a disconnect between what principals and district leaders actually report their families, what they believe their families want. So I think we need to do more to bridge that gap between making sure that our rural principals and administrators, our rural districts and administrators understand the importance and demand for computer science, and that we can help bridge that gap between what we know communities are advocating for and what is actually offered in their schools. We see a similar trend with Title I eligibility. So schools that are eligible for Title I, which is a complex, as many of you know, is a complex formula. It takes a lot of income considerations into it. Schools that are not Title I eligible have a higher rate of computer science offered. Not as striking of a gap as some of the other correlations we've been through here, but still schools that are Title I eligible seem to offer computer science at a lower rate than non-Title I schools. The other interesting thing we can look at with regard to whether schools are offering computer science or not is which policies they've implemented in their states. So we can isolate which policies states have enacted and then come up with a number to tell us, if you implement this policy, what's the likelihood your high schools offer computer science? So the first one that we talked about was having a state plan. And you can see here, this is actually the one that correlates most strongly with whether states offer computer science or not. If they have a state plan, 60% of their schools on average will offer a computer science course at the high school level. Now, this comes with the caveat that that this is a pretty small sample size, and I think this is also a little bit of a question of correlation rather than causation necessarily, whereas states that are investing in a state plan and bringing stakeholders together to discuss how they're going to have more students access computer science are probably going to be ones that are already thinking along these lines and implementing other policies to improve computer science access. The second policy shows having standards compared to access for computer science. So states that have standards, unsurprisingly, also show a higher degree of students that are taking or are offered computer science in their high school experience. Funding is another one that shows a pretty strong correlation. And actually, if you're not funding professional learning for teachers, you have a pretty low chance of offering computer science in your state. Whereas if you have a dedicated funding stream to funding professional learning for teachers in computer science, obviously you're going to have more teachers accessing that professional development if there are dollars and funding streams dedicated to it. And so you're going to have more teachers teaching it. So this kind of makes sense on an intuitive level, but it's good to see as well. Pre-service teacher preparation programs, again, we talked about that. And unsurprisingly, when you have pre-service programs that are training teachers, your state is going to be more likely to offer computer science at the high school level. Having a state supervisor, likewise, also increases access to computer science. And then another strong correlation is requiring schools to teach computer science. So when you have a policy in place that requires all schools to teach computer science, like Indiana does, you're going to see those participation rates go up. And again, this is an area where I would expect to see this go up, because we've only had states pass these policies really in the past 3 years or so. And if you remember back to the 9 policies, one of the things we really call out on there is not just that you require all schools to offer computer science right away, but that there are appropriate implementation timelines as well. So it's really important that we're not passing policies that just say, okay, this fall every school has to teach computer science. We have had states do that, and it doesn't go well. So we're never going to advocate for a school to just, or for a state to just do that overnight for its schools. But rather to make sure there are appropriate timelines in place for implementation. So because we've just had states start to pass these laws, like Indiana, we're going to continue to see this increase over the next few years, I would anticipate. So Indiana, really successful at this here, just in the past year or two, specifically with regard to the 9 policies. I know there's been a lot of great work done on the ground by a lot of these organizations that contributed to CS for Indiana and our efforts last year. But last year we saw comprehensive computer science legislation that created a fund for professional learning for educators, which again we know is going to be real critical to increasing the workforce for computer science in our schools, and also a policy for all schools to offer that was signed into law, which goes into effect, I believe, by fall of 2021 is when the deadline is for that. So we were really excited about this. I'm excited for Code.org to be able to work with all these organizations that were part of CS for Indiana and moving this forward last year. We found it really important that not only was there this requirement for all schools to offer an appropriate timeline for that, but also we weren't just going to leave schools hanging out to dry on that and just say, well, you have to go figure it out yourself. It's important that teachers have access to the training and professional learning opportunities they need to be able to teach computer science as well. So we are glad that both those laws passed last year. And so with regard to where Indiana currently stands right now, we have the 9 policies here. And I'll say, again, this graphic is already out of date when it got sent to the publisher about a month ago. This is true for Indiana. But I will say, just going through these here, funding is currently a yes for computer science. So we didn't have Indiana as a yes yet because although the fund had been created, those dollars weren't out the door to actually focus on professional learning, and now they have been, and we hope that that'll continue, which I'll talk about here in just a second. And also, I believe Indiana is going to be a yes pretty soon on state plan, the first policy. I think the department is going to be working hard very soon to create kind of a state plan for, okay, well, we know we have this goal for 2021. How do we actually ensure access for all students across the state, across all communities, whether it's Indianapolis or Gary or Evansville or Rushville or anywhere in between, to make sure that all students have access. So I'd anticipate Indiana will actually be a yes on that pretty soon. And I would also think they're going to be a yes on standards pretty soon. And I should clarify here, Indiana is just a no on our rubric for standards because we want states to have comprehensive K-12 standalone computer science standards. Indiana does have those for K-8. The 9 through 12 standards are actually embedded within CTE right now and for individual courses, which I think is actually fine and has worked well for Indiana. I don't have really any immediate concerns over how the state has done its standards, other than I do think it's important that we have standalone standards for sustainability purposes. So we just want there to be a situation in a state where those standards are under CTE, and then there's a new CTE director, 10 years down the road or 20 years down the road that says, oh, we're going to revise these standards, and then all of a sudden computer science goes away. That's why it's really important for us is for sustainability for those standards to be standalone. And I believe the Department of Education is going to be thinking very critically about that. So once those things do get done, I think Indiana is well positioned to be just the third state that's going to be a yes on all 9 policies here. And I would anticipate that happens in fairly short order. The other ones are Arkansas and Idaho. Actually, just yesterday, published their state plan, making them the second 9 out of 9 state. There's a couple of other states that are in contention for that distinction. Maryland is getting really close. Virginia is getting pretty close to those things. So there is a possibility of those states catching up. But I think with Indiana implementing all policies and the head start we kind of already have on the great work that's already been done by teachers and universities and districts on the ground already to build up the access to computer science in Indiana, I'd anticipate once we have all those policies in place, Indiana can really be a leader nationally for computer science, like one of the 2 or 3 states we really point to and say, this is how you do computer science and make it fundamental for all students in a given state. That's something that, as I said, as a native Hoosier, I'm really proud of and really excited and honored to have the privilege to work on with you all and with everyone in the state. So that's kind of where we are and where we've been in the past year with Indiana. I do want to talk briefly about what that means for this year and where we see those things going. So I already touched on kind of the standards and state plan. I think those things kind of are in place already. It's just a matter of modifying those to really make sure they're rock solid and sustainable and everyone feels good about those moving forward in the state. Really, our major priority is ensuring that the funding for computer science professional development continues in Indiana this year and beyond. So knowing that it's a budget year, this is going to be really important that we continue to replenish that fund that was set up in the previous legislation last year that I mentioned. So we can continue to make sure that all schools have access to training their teachers to teach computer science. We think this would be about $6 million is a rough industry-wide average cost for a state for Indiana specifically, to train to get enough teachers to provide it in all elementary and all high schools. And that's not $6 million a year. That's not $6 million now and $6 million in 10 years or something. We think that's about a one-time investment of around $6 million that would provide enough training and professional development and grants to providers to ensure that that computer science is offered in every school as the law requires. So that would be spread out over the next 3 or 4 years or so. And so that's been our ask for any conversation we're having in Indiana is around that number of 6 million. So we've spoken with the governor's office and legislature and Department of Education talking about kind of these numbers and these estimates of what we think it would take to provide enough professional learning for teachers for all schools in the state. And that's about the amount we're looking for. So I would ask this group, as we're continuing to move forward in Indiana, to keep that number in mind as you're having conversations with stakeholders or your legislators as the budget session gets underway here. That's kind of the target we're shooting for, knowing, with the legislative process, you don't always get what you're asking for, and certainly you don't always get what you're asking for right away. So there may be some steps to getting there. That's sort of the number we have in mind and what we see coming ahead for Indiana in order to ensure we meet this goal by the fall of 2021. So that's really our main priority for Indiana. I would say, we're open to other conversations, and the 9 policies are not. There are 9 policies, and we feel good about them. With that being said, we recognize there are other things states can be doing and other actions that are certainly worthy of attention. We can be paying attention to ensure that all students have access, and we're going to be behind those initiatives as well. Those just haven't, either we don't have a specific policy aim for it yet, or we haven't quite figured out how to go about it. I think to the credit of the major stakeholders in Indiana, the question I get the most often from, and honestly, I get this question more in Indiana than I have in any other state I've worked in. They say, well, what's next beyond the 9? That's a great question to ask. And that makes me really proud of my home state that we're already thinking about, well, what do we do after these 9 policies and how do we ensure this is sustainable? So I think there are some conversations ahead that, I would kind of love this group's input on, and other stakeholders around the state, thinking about how we make this sustainable, especially at the pre-service level. So are there things we can do to ensure that anybody getting prepared, whether through a traditional pre-service program, an alternate route program, how do we make sure they're prepared to teach computer science, either embedded if they're an elementary school teacher, or so that their schools have the flexibility to offer computer science courses at the high school level? What changes do we need to make around the state to ensure that's happening? And are there policies that we can put in place? I really think that's sort of like what's beyond the 9, because it's great to get all this stuff set up, but really to have it be an integrated part of an education system, we need to think of computer science the same way we think of biology or chemistry or algebra or those things, not in place of those things, but to put it on the same tier as those kind of subject areas where you have teachers prepared, whether they're a 3rd grade teacher or they're a high school science teacher, like they're getting biology content or life science standards as part of the standards they're expected to address in their classrooms. So we need to make sure that our teachers that are teaching computer science have that same opportunity as well. So I think that's also what's kind of next. Unfortunately, I don't have like a clear answer yet on what that means for action steps or how to advocate for that, or what the appropriate path to pursue that will be. But I just say that to say, I think that's very much an open conversation we're interested in having with the state for as far as like a direct place we know we're taking things in Indiana. The funding piece would really be important to us to make sure that multiple providers all across the state can offer professional learning opportunities for teachers so that they can meet that requirement in their schools. So that's about all I have as far as kind of computer science policy and momentum nationally and also in Indiana. Would be happy to answer any questions folks might have as well.
Pitfalls that you've come across in terms of the hard line nose as to moving this agenda forward?
Okay, so Myron asks, what role do the CSTA standards play in your policies?
Sure. So was there something in particular you had in mind, or somewhere in the policies you see them fitting in? Okay, not hearing that clarification. I can say that we work closely with the CSTA, and in fact, they co-authored our State of CS Access report that we just released last month. So CSTA has been pretty involved with us all along the way in doing it. We don't have specific recommendations within our policies for curricula or standards even. Like we want them to be rigorous standards. And certainly many states have adopted CSTA standards or started with CSTA standards and kind of molded them into their own. And we've been supportive of those standards, and those standards have certainly counted for making CS count. But that's Yeah, so we work closely with CSDA and have for a while. I think that's generally how we've worked together and how it fits into the 9 policies. And I hope that answers your question.
If anyone has any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and speak loudly so that we can all hear. That's why Sean is here to answer any questions. So now is your time.
What is the biggest roadblock that you feel like you've come across in Indiana to move this agenda forward?
Sorry, I was muted myself. That's a great question. Yeah, honestly, Indiana, don't tell my coworkers this. Indiana's been a really easy and great state to work with. If you talk to any of my coworkers or anyone on my team, please make sure they know how hard it's been and how everyone really appreciates the hard work I've done. But honestly, everyone from like the governor's office and the legislature and the Department of Education has like really been have really been leaders in this space, along with on the ground groups that have made up CS for Indiana. I can tell you my experience in other states has been it's really hard to get like callbacks sometimes from companies and organizations to like get engaged or invested, which makes sense. They have like kind of their own things going on and own things to lobby for. The response to this in Indiana has been like really swift, and I've been impressed with the leadership. I think the real hard thing though is going to be implementation. Like now that we have these policies in place in Indiana, I was actually thinking about this today. in just a moment I had when I was driving my daughter to school, when your mind kind of wanders, I was like, I've been thinking like when we have another year under our belt towards moving toward the 2021 goal of all schools offering, I anticipate the number of schools that are offering computer science will go up. But what if it doesn't? Like, what if we go back and in this report next year, it's still at 52% or it's only at 54% or something? I was wondering what then. And I think that's going to be the main challenge that I see is really putting going A to Z. Like I think we have Z and we have A. What are the steps we actually need to implement to make sure small and rural schools can take advantage of the dollars that are going to be there for professional development and the resources that are going to be made available, and also just like offering that and adding that to their course offerings. And I don't have a great answer for that yet. It's a little bit scary given that Indiana has taken such a strong leadership role in this, because one of the drawbacks to being a leader in this is we don't necessarily have a direct example that we can look to and say, here's the state we're modeling ourselves after. We're kind of doing it our own way, which I think is great and makes a lot of sense for Indiana, given the momentum and the great work that's going on the ground already across the state. So I guess that's the one roadblock I see, is that we've had so much momentum. That's one thing that keeps me up at night kind of for Indiana. How are we going to actually put this all together now that we have this in place? There's a lot of pressure on us as a state to do that, I think. I saw there's another question in the chat asking to define computer science versus IT, coding, and data analytics. I think at code.org, we've adopted the K-12 CS framework definition of computer science, which you can just go to k12cs.org. But this was kind of a broad vision that was put together by multiple stakeholders which Code.org was involved with, but we didn't lead or necessarily dictate or anything, but we were a part of, and they defined it as the study of computers and algorithmic processes, including their principles, their hardware and software designs, their implementation, and their impact on society. So we think it really incorporates all those things, and it includes things like cybersecurity and coding, analytics, computational thinking. That's all included in there, but that's really the definition that we've adopted for computer science at Code.org.
Another question, Sean, was what are some recommendations you can make to Indiana to increase female students' engagement?
That's a great question, and one where we think very critically about it at Code.org, and we're very proud that we've actually just surpassed this past year over 10 million girls worldwide on Code.org, which is fantastic. We're very excited about that, and we've also seen some results from some of these some related policy elements to what we've been talking about with regard to our 9 policies, that when these kind of ideas are implemented, you do see female participation go up in schools, which is fantastic. So one of those would be, I think, AP CS principles has gone a really long way in helping to close that achievement gap. So we see female participation in AP CS going up every year. Not only is participation going up, but it's also closing the gap between male and female participants in those courses. So really, I think this is a question of access. And, we could talk all day, and I would love to have a conversation and talk all day about sort of what we've seen and the various research that's out there on increasing participation among girls across the country. I do think in addition to just expanding access, I think starting early is also a real good benefit that we've seen in terms of the research suggesting that when you start earlier, it's more likely to stick, especially when it's a consistent component throughout the K-8 experience. And that's why Indiana has a chance to really do something special here. I think, when I talked about the 9 policies, we talked about all schools offering computer science at the high school level. That's more of an implementation issue, but now that it is embedded in the K-8 standards, and the expectation is that all schools are offering, not just high schools, I think we have a chance to address the sort of unfortunate drop-off that we see among female participation in STEM fields that happens around like 4th, 5th, or 6th grade. So you see early on in academic careers, I think the research suggests that girls are just as likely as boys to be interested in those STEM fields. And then unfortunately, we see a drop off around those middle grades. And then it picks back up again around late junior high and early high school. But unfortunately, by that time, there's already kind of been this shift where there's been a drop off. So some of those students may be farther behind and may no longer have the interest or be as good at it as when they were first interested. So that's really what we have to combat against. And I think all schools offering is a great start beyond just sort of the general 9 policies of ensuring that there's equitable access and that all students have opportunity to it, in addition to those things that are like making sure it counts toward a graduation requirement.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of going off of that, Sean, how can we get the community to help get the funding approved or like get it through?
Yeah, I think, paying attention to the budget process, and certainly I'll remain engaged with CS for Indiana and this group along the way. But as the budget process is coming through, I think we'll have opportunities for folks to weigh in and contact their legislators to ensure that they understand the importance of computer science, and not just that we passed this, but now we actually have to implement it. But I don't think that necessarily has to wait for the state budget to come out. Those are conversations that hopefully are ongoing, and ensuring that our elected leaders and our leaders at the Department of Education understand that we have work to do on the implementation side, and that this funding is really going to be what moves the needle toward implementation and meeting that goal.
Yeah, and we had someone ask, do you see the rural community as our biggest challenge right now?
That's a good question. I see it as a challenge. I would hesitate to necessarily, like, I wouldn't know how to compare, the challenge of implementing in a rural district, and rural districts can vary so much from one to the next, and our more urban districts or our more financially strapped districts, like, those are all issues that nobody has really figured out. I think I think access to rural schools is going to be something we have to think really critically and proactively about. And we can do that in a few different ways. I think it comes a lot in the kind of outreach we're doing to schools, either through the department or through any policies we pass. But I know other states have done things like prioritizing rural schools to ensuring that they have access to the dollars they need. And maybe that's a different amount for what a rural school needs to do their training than another municipality school. I don't know that we have the specific data to make a recommendation on that right now, but those are the questions we should be asking and working toward to figure out how we address the rural challenge. I can tell you there have been great strides made in states like Wyoming, which I was also fortunate to work in, that had a comprehensive bill passed last session. It was actually like the day before Indiana's bill passed. So it was a really busy week for me. But they've been thinking about how to do this because basically all of their school districts are rural, except for like maybe 2 or 3 or something. And they've been going around to each district. Their Department of Ed has gone to each district specifically to kind of work through a plan with them to figure out how they're going to implement. And that's been really successful in Wyoming. Although it's a large area in terms of square miles, they only have like 48 districts statewide, I think. So that's something that they can sort of do and plan to do. It might be a lot harder in Indiana, but I still think there's ways we can think proactively about how we do outreach to those rural communities. And that's something that at code.org we're hoping to be able to take the lead on as we're gathering best practices from rural communities. And I'll preview for this group that we're actually working on a rural recommendations white paper for computer science. This is something that we've been thinking about for a while. And I'm working with one of my colleagues on our education team to sort of define what the issues are, and then kind of have a collection of best practices of what states have done to ensure that rural students have equitable access to CS. So hopefully that'll be coming out here before the end of the year.
Yeah, and then Sean, we had a comment that says, finding teachers in general is difficult. I imagine finding CS teachers is even more difficult. How is Indiana and the nation attacking this challenge?
Yeah. Well, first I would acknowledge that's certainly true. As Jane mentioned at the beginning of the call, in a former life, I was a human capital consultant to a large urban district myself. So I was working on these problems pretty intimately day to day and quite a bit. So I can confirm that's the case. But while I agree that it is difficult to find teachers, I think one of the reasons we see the professional learning as being so important to teachers is that it's not about finding CS teachers, it's about finding teachers that teach CS. And I think that's a distinction to make, because I think that's immediately where a lot of policymakers' heads go when we first approach states about this and say, well, all schools offer, and they say, that's great. I have a district that can't even find a math teacher. What am I supposed to do? And then tell them they have to find a CS teacher. And that's a very valid and reasonable concern that I understand, as I said. But what we have been able to demonstrate is you can train teachers up to teach computer science, maybe not every computer science course, but at least the kind of foundational course like AP CS Principles, or like the CS Principles course in high school. And those teachers who are teaching it for the first time, that have been through the professional development that we've provided, have done almost as well as teachers who are more experienced in teaching the course by AP test results. So we're really excited about some of the progress we've seen there, and we know that teachers can this is something you can develop teachers into teaching, and it's much less about the content and more about teaching techniques and facilitating learning and being a lead learner in a classroom is sort of our approach. But all that being said, I think there are some other things too that states have done that are innovative. And I have to give a shout out to my alma mater, Indiana University, that I think has done a great job at this in terms of providing it to all teachers, so that you're not going out finding new teachers, but new teachers are coming to the classroom with a skill already. And then there are also incentives that states have created to get teachers more interested in this. So whether that's a micro-credential or professional learning hours or credits, whether that's dealing with pay scales or structures. I know Kentucky is starting to look into this right now for computer science teachers or teachers that have been certified or endorsed to teach computer science. I think there are a lot of those kind of creative solutions that states have undertaken as well that are interesting and promising, but we really haven't seen widespread enough to make a specific recommendations and say, like, yeah, all states should do this. But there are those unique opportunities that I think are worthy of exploring.
Are there any final questions as we start to wrap up? Okay, well, Sean, thank you so much for leading this call and answering everyone's questions. Would it be okay if someone does think of a question, they could email it to me and I could send it your way?
For sure, yeah. Or as always, just feel free to email me directly. You can reach me at sean@code.org, and you can find our entire State of Computer Science and K-12 Access report at advocacy.code.org. And if you have questions on that or need materials, like we have a public bank of resources that folks can use the same graphics and slides I just used. If you're using it with your stakeholders or districts or whomever, I'm happy to share anything we have.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to send out a recap to the whole network, so I'll make sure to include your email and all of those resources. But thank you again, Sean, and thank you to everyone that came to the call. We really, really appreciate it and hope you got a lot from it. So thank you.